Everybody, thanks for coming today to today's brown bag lunch by the the Gender Equity Initiative, part of the AVAA. Thank you so much. Still getting over our New York fair. Today we have Erin Waters, and I'm so happy she came to talk to us about photography. So I'm going to just do a quick intro right here. So Erin Waters joined the AVA in 2021, but has been a full-time dealer since 2007. She collected photographs at the age of 8, following in her father's footsteps. Her collections include selections of pre-revolutionary Russian images, interiors, and unusual photo postcards. She has a degree in Russian studies from Hamilton College and spent her junior year in Yaroslav, Russia. For her thesis, she researched the history of photography, typologies, and the idea of empire in Russia. After Hamilton, she was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship in Russia, where she conducted an oral history and photography project with older Russian women. Waters has a Master's of Arts in Museum Studies from NYU. While in New York, she interned in Sotheby's Photographs Department. Her master's thesis explored vernacular photographs placed in art museums, utilizing interviews with collectors, curators, and dealers. Waters enjoys speaking about photography and has given papers at number of international conferences on both copy photography and how people use photography in their personal spaces. Welcome, Erin.
Hi.
Hi. Just wanted to remind everybody to keep things on mute, and if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box, and we'll have a Q&A when Erin is done. So take it away, Erin.
All right, let me share the screen here. Okay, first of all, I just wanted to say I tend to go on rambling, so feel free to cut me off, Lizzie, or anyone else. But I realize Stacy is talking next week about snapshots, so I'm probably not going to talk a lot about them since I don't want to step on her toes. So I'm going to focus on other things. And I'm not going to go too much into what is a vernacular photograph or what does that mean. There's lots of papers and even books about that if you want to read up. But typically, personally, I think vernacular covers a really wide range of photography these days, whether you're talking about daguerreotype portraiture or photo albums or portrait photographs by essentially anonymous photographers. Like for me, that's what it covers. I think it covers different things for different people. You can also add in press photos, real photo postcards, etc. The postcard here is one from my personal collection. It's a favorite of mine for a lot of reasons. It was taken on the Massachusetts coast. I forget which city at this point. I think Salem. So I'm going to start at the beginning with daguerreotypes. This is one of my dad's catalogs from back in the 90s. But it gives you a good view of a daguerreotype camera. And you can see, just to give you an idea of what, this isn't even the earliest one, but what a daguerreotyped camera would look like. So the plate would go in the back and the lens cap would come off and you'd expose it to light for a certain number of seconds or minutes, depending on how much light there was in the room. And then you'd develop out the image. There's no negative involved. So what is a daguerreotype? A very early one would kind of look like this. This one's heavily solarized. That's what all the blue is. There was a little too much going on there in the whites. And you can see it's really distorted. The maker didn't have a good lens. And the person stamped daguerreotype on the mat at the bottom. My father collected these early daguerreotypes, especially in the US. So this is an example of one of his. So what were daguerreotypes? Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre was French, of course, given that name. He publicized daguerreotypes in 1839, although he had been working on them for the previous decade, and with a partner, a guy named Niepce, who passed away. He had been working on them. Niepce had in the 1820s as well. But Daguerre made the process his own and perfected it and essentially gave it to the French people. And the French decided that they would allow anyone to make these things, and said, all right, we're just going to give it out for free, which was very nice of them. They could have patented it and made people pay for it, but they realized the importance of such. They didn't really think of it as an art form yet, but such a process, I guess, a copying process, they thought of it. Because at that point, the process wasn't quick enough to take the human form. Daguerre's exposures were really long. He could barely catch a human unless they stood still for a long length of time. So the daguerreotypes were a copper plate coated with silver, which was then highly polished and made light sensitive by a bunch of poisonous chemicals. You really wanted a well-ventilated room when you were working with these things. Once the process got to the US, which was in the fall of 1839, although people here knew about it before then, of course, it became very, very popular. And over the next couple of decades, millions and millions of them were made here. And so this one was made, at the heyday. Daguerreotypes are very fragile. Don't take them apart. One of the things that we do, especially my brother, is restoration, which mostly involves just changing the glass. The first thing you see with a daguerreotype or another cased image is the case itself, which is to protect it. So this is an assemblage of ones that I got last week at Brimfield. It was a good week. And so you can see front and center there is that remarkable and very rare red one. It's a metal and leather composite, very protective. There was an ambrotype inside. Most common, of course, are the leather ones. And then the upper center is a paper covered case. Those are mostly for ambrotypes and tintypes. And then you have the thermoplastic, also called union cases because they were prominent during the Civil War. And they're not gutta percha. A lot of people still call them that, but gutta percha is an entirely different thing. So since we do a lot with daguerreotypes out of the cases, we do get to see more than most people do. These are two out of the frame, so to speak, with that, so you can see under the mat. The one on the left is a kind of haunting father holding his little kid. That's his leg in the foreground. It was a lot closer to the camera, so it's extra huge. And then the one on the right is actually a copy of another daguerreotype. You can see on the left hand side some nails that were holding it in place, and the little boy is holding a toy gun. So I'm sure some of you have seen daguerreotypes that were tinted before. I don't know if any of you have seen ones that were this good. These are two really, really well tinted images. The one on the left is a postmortem. the kid had died, obviously, and the father wanted a picture of his little girl before they buried her. And then the one on the right is kind of crazy. I don't think that backdrop was really there. They kind of just were like, all right, we're just going to do it. We've seen one other like that. So the guy or gal who painted it used the backdrop idea at least twice. Of course, daguerreotypists, some of the first daguerreotypes were made outside just because, out of necessity, because there was more light there. But once the process hit here in America, it went sort of nuts, and people were experimenting and perfected it rather quickly. And one of the places they brought cameras were, of course, out to California with the gold rush. So this one was made around 1850, and it's of a Union house, which I think we weren't really sure where exactly it was, but it's definitely in California. You can see the group of gold miners out front. They're wearing typical clothes for that era. And then the guy at the far left, which adds a sense of scale to the picture. And then just to give you a sense of, what were the Europeans doing at the time, I kind of focused on a lot of American things. This is a typical European presentation. I pulled this off the net because I don't have a lot of European dags, but this is a passe-partout frame, which is what most European dags come in. So right here we have 2 more 6-plate daguerreotypes, just to give you a sense of just some really good portraiture. And here, this is Lincoln, obviously without the beard, 1840s image. And I had used this in another talk once, what would $1 million dag look like? Probably something like this. If you found this out in the wild, I wish, but yeah, keep your eyes out. There's probably another one out there. So moving on to paper photography, salt prints, you'll find a lot of these in books, albums, and then also tipped in to books, salt prints and albumen prints, but these are in autograph albums that I've owned in the last couple of years. They're both dated around the one on the left is 1861, and I thought the other one was about the same, although it wasn't dated. So salt prints, they were invented, although like daguerreotypes, they were being experimented a lot earlier, but like daguerreotypes, they came out with the process in 1839. Henry Fox Talbot in England came up with that, and he called it calotypes, but a lot of people called them Talbot types, because unlike Daguerre, he decided to make people pay for his process. So if you wanted to use his process, say here in the US, it was rather expensive to take out a patent. The Langenheim brothers here in Philly, near where I live, they almost went bankrupt trying to make it work making Talbot types. They made good ones. They were excellent daguerreotypists as well, but it wasn't a good idea for them. And then this guy, John Adams Whipple in Boston, he just decided to make his own process and call it the crystallotype. And he did not go broke, because I don't think he actually paid the patent. And you may have heard of the crystallotype because what's the book's name? Homes of American Statesmen has a crystallotype in it, and I think it's the first book to use a photo in it. So around the same time, in 1854, and then tintypes and ambrotypes came out on the scene. So this is a kind of wacky one that's one of my favorites in my collection. It was a poured collodion emulsion on glass. So another fragile image, but not as fragile as daguerreotypes. You know, if you touch it, the emulsion is not gonna wipe away, but if you break it, it's definitely gonna crack. So there are many different types. You can back them in many different ways. You can paint them, you can back them with paper or cloth. You can even pour the emulsion on a dark colored glass to make it positive that way. They only lasted here in the US until about the 1870s, but in the UK, they were making them well into the 20th century. And you can see them like made on the beaches or carnival scenes. And this is in the UK. And they were just really, really popular because they didn't really make tintypes in the UK. So they made the later ambrotypes instead. These are two more examples. I think I've sold the one on the right, but the one on the left I still have. I really like hand-colored images. The one on the left I've owned twice now. I sold it and then bought it back. I like the fact that here the imagination took control. I don't think either of these backdrops existed in real life. The little kid was there, and then they just were like, okay, where was this little kid standing? I'm totally going to make it up. Artistic license. And with the one on the right, since it's a paper print and it's totally painted over, I would really need to get a loop out and have someone who knows a little more than I do about how to look at that face and figure out. So I think that's the only part that's not completely colored over, to figure out what kind of print it is, because I'm not sure. So like I said, tintypes came out at around the same time as ambrotypes. It's the same emulsion, but on metal. They're a little more durable. They originally came in cases like dags and ambros, though. They're also fragile. You don't want to be wiping them, rubbing them, washing them in water. They were made here, like I mentioned, well into the 20th century. They were a standard size. You know, most of them were like a CDV, just because they were going to fit into an album. So the one on the right, I've owned since I was a teenager. I just find that little boy really haunting. And it's really unusual because the kid is standing up and stayed completely still. And then the one on the left is a really, really cool example of, you've all seen photos where the person puts their head in like a comic drawing and takes a picture. Well, that's like one of the best ones you'll ever see. So they were doing it in the 19th century. These are two more really good tintypes. The lighting on the one on the left is just really superb. And then the portraiture on the one on the right is really great. One of the things I collect are these really crazy painted backdrops. So the woman sitting there in front of that ridiculous ocean full of swimmers is pretty fun. And then the little album I've had for a couple of years and kept it because I think it has something to do with my high school. I have to get someone from the archives to tell me if the guy went there. So I've mentioned albumen prints a couple of times. You'll see a lot of them just portraiture like this one. And in frames, this one was probably framed in, a walnut frame at some point, under a paper mat. And oftentimes they get pulled out of the frame to have something reframed, and it ends up in a stack somewhere. But this one remains in pretty good condition. It has, that nice brown tone. It's not badly faded. And this is the type of photo that, all those Western scenes are printed in, like Watkins or Russell, or, all those famous photographers that you want to find at Brimfield or something. So carte de visites, they were invented in France, the size anyway, and named there. But it was Queen Victoria who really made them take off, because she started passing them out to all her friends, and they were like, ooh, this is fun, I'm going to get into this. And then pretty much everyone was having them made, and it crossed over the Atlantic, and there you have it. Now there are still millions of them. And I bought all these. Well, I found all of them. My brother bought the top two, but I found all of these at Brimfield last week. Just a little sampling of what's still out there, and lots of different kinds of things. These are all albumen CDVs. You can find different types of prints later on in the 19th century, but these are all 1860s. So these are a little more unusual ones. The one on the right is a copy of a pretty crazy frame filled with daguerreotypes, probably some ambrotypes and tintypes. I wish I had that. If anyone knows where it is, tell me. But I like copy photography. And then the one on the left is a collage, maybe of an actor lost to time, who that guy is, but I like that kind of thing too. So these, we move on to cabinet cards, which are, the larger version of the CDV, for lack of a better word. And I collect the Russian ones. We have here one by William Carrick, who was a Scotsman. He was born in St. Peter's. Well, he was born in Scotland, but he lived his whole life in St. Petersburg in Russia. And he was a really, really good photographer. And he traveled out a couple times into the country to make these wonderful images of peasants working the fields and just in the villages. And he was part of, it was the 1860s and 70s. So it was part of this whole artistic movement in Russia at the time. And then the bottom is a photo montage of these women at the prison outside in Versailles in 1871. And you can find different copies of that bottom photo. This isn't the only one I've ever seen. So more cabinet cards. One of the things I like is when people manipulate negatives. The one on the right is added snow. So all those little white dots are a snow effect. And that was done in the negative. People were doing a lot in the negative like that. You could add, anything you wanted, early Photoshop, if you will. You could, retouch someone's face, or you could, do something like that. These two, the one on the left is 1890s, judging by those sleeves. And people were starting to invent or just make up their own names for different papers at that time. And so here we have one in Detroit. We have American Aristotype Company's Aristo Platino paper. That looks like it was taken from some kind of advertising book, given the paper on the side. And then on the right, we have a cabinet card. It's a vignette with a photogram of some ferns, which is pretty cool. So at the same time that all these portraits were being made in studios, in the 1880s, all of a sudden Eastman and Kodak came out with snapshot cameras, which are, were the box cameras. Very early roll film, you would make it in the camera and send the whole thing back to Rochester and get it mailed back to you, get the prints mailed back to you with a new camera with film. So the first ones were the smaller circle size on the left, and the second ones, the number 2s, were a little larger, the ones on the right. And they came mounted like cabinet cards, although they were a little smaller in size, a little shorter. But they were essentially the same idea. Also at this time, you could buy your own view camera if you wanted to be all artsy. And I think the one on the left was made like that. And the one on the right was made by a very experienced amateur, I guess I would say. We got a bunch of his photographs maybe like 10 years ago, and that's one of them. And so he definitely, I don't think he was ever a professional, but he could have been. And so he owned his own camera, and he went out and made all of these photographs and printed them at home. And so this was the beginning of the time too, when you could print your own photographs at home more easily. And there were photo magazines telling you, this is what you can do, this is how you can do it. And I'm sure a lot of you have come across these magazines and seen all of these advertisements. So also at this time, you could get, these came from the same album, the cabinet card on the left and the mounted photo, which it was a snapshot. That was a standard snapshot size, which they mounted on the right. So you could get these made at the same time. It was all happening at once in the 1880s and 90s. So the next decade, Kodak came out with that tiny, tiny camera, which you can see in the mirror, which was a pocket Kodak. It could fit in your pocket, as the name suggested. And people took it everywhere. And it was also a little roll film, and it made these tiny, tiny photos like that. And they often came mounted, or you could put them in an album. And then the one on the bottom is on, it's hard to tell here, but it's like a much richer paper that came out around 1900, a snapshot paper, kind of, I don't know how to, it's more toothy. It's a really nice print. It's one of my favorite kinds of snapshots. And here's my favorite kind of photo. It's hard to describe in person, but like I said, that snapshot is kind of toothy. Platinum prints, portraits were really prominent around 1900 and like up to like 1920. So we have like, you see these all the time, especially they're in the type of pictures that come in folders. These are out of the folders, and obviously were probably framed at some time given those rings around them. But you can see the photos remained kind of perfect. They don't tend to fade, and it just makes them really beautiful. This was made probably a little later, but around the same time. You see more mounted photos in the early 20th century, larger. This one's about 8x10, lots of, workers and that type of thing. just to, the camera is getting out of the studio more. Also at this time, you're getting more novelty photos. So these are penny photos. I call them the proto photo booths because you're giving, people are having a bit more fun. These are more tame, I guess, but people would add the funny hats and have props and etc. And I took the one in my hand just so you can see how small it is. The one on the right is a little girl's cyanotype. It's about the size of a Kodak #2, although I'm not quite sure if it is. And then the one on the left is a set of photographs. Not really sure where they are right now. Sometimes you lose things in your house, but I will find them again because they're, as you can see, they're really cool. People were always experimenting with photography. What could you photograph? The little sign there says phenomenon of polarized light. So they weren't taking pictures of an object or a person. They were taking pictures of light itself. And so cyanotypes, which are these blue photos, were actually around since the dawn of photography. Like they were around since the 1840s. But they became really, really popular in the 1890s, early 20th century, because they're super easy to make at home. You don't even need a darkroom. And since people were experimenting with their own photography, their own cameras, you really started to see more of them in albums and snapshot albums, and especially at colleges, like kids in dorm rooms could make them without having anything more than just some water to rinse the photos off after they had negatives printed. Also around this time, there's been several revivals of daguerreotypes over the years. We're currently in one now, but there was one around 1900. A lot of people I know, including myself, bid on this on eBay a couple of years ago. And I kept the image, of course, but one of the ways that you can easily date photography is by the clothing. Like this is a daguerreotype, and you're like, okay, so that means that's, between 1840 and 1860. No. You look at the clothes and you're like, those are not clothes from that era. So one of the clothes from, you got to jump forward like 50 years, right? So there, a number of people were making them at that time in New York, Chicago, probably some other places. As Lizzie mentioned in my bio, I love real photo postcards. These are some I got last week. Just some fun, regular, kids and people having shenanigans. These are some more fancy ones, I guess. A guy on a paper moon with a biplane and some stars, and Mom and Pa, I'm 100% sure she's wearing a wig, in front of the flag. And the amount of diversity you see in postcards is really ridiculous. It just, like snapshots, you just see a plethora of different imagery. And unlike snapshots, you see them in the studio and out of the studio, which I really like, because people were using the same cameras to make postcard images as they were to make snapshots. It was just a different back to the picture. And they were using them to mail. And since they were using them to mail them to someone, there's often like fun little notes on the back and descriptions of their day. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the photo on the front. But when it does, often it's pretty funny. This is how I first got into postcards, where these mass-produced, often French, crazily tinted things. They are photos. Some people don't consider them photos, but they are. They're photographic. They're hand tinted by people. They're not all identical. And, you know, yes, they were models posing for that, but they still were printed by hand. You know, it wasn't like, you know, maybe they were in a factory, but they are valuable, and they are, some of them are very valuable, actually. And then here we have folder photos. A friend of mine and I have a joke that these are like the least loved photographs right now. And I buy the good ones when I can, because I think there's nowhere to go but up with them. A lot of them are really bad because there's so many high school and college portraits. But you know, what can you do? So you really have to dig sometimes to find good ones, but when you find good ones, they're often really good. And like I mentioned, some of my favorite platinum prints or carbon prints, or those really, really great early 20th century portraits, are in this type of folder type image. I put in oratones like last minute, like maybe an hour ago, because I was like, I didn't talk about anything like glass related in the 20th century. And they're really beautiful. This one is in my collection. And I think they're often like a misunderstood thing. I swiped this image off of a website about Curtis. Oratones are golden in color. You know, oro is the base, meaning gold. And the name came from Edward Curtis. He is credited with giving the name for orotone. And so it has this metallic gold backing, and then you have the image and then the glass plate. So like daguerreotypes, they're fragile, like ambrotypes, they're on glass, and they always come in frames, or like this next one in this case with a cover that you can close. So it's this intimate portrait. This one is by this guy, Marceau, who I think is in Chicago. Don't quote me on that, but he's one of the most common portrait orotone makers of the like 1920s. And then this one, a lot of you might recognize. It's The Vanishing Race by Edward Curtis. You can find non-orotone images of it. This one is an orotone in its original frame. And a lot of his oratones come in these types of frames. So at the same time, you know, this is at the total other end of the spectrum, but at the same exact period, you know, this is what the street photographers were doing. They're making these, what I call paper tintypes, has the similar emulsion, but it's poured on paper instead of metal. And they come in these little fun frames with all the different kinds of sayings on them. You never know what. Sometimes they are really jarringly not have nothing to do with what the image is. And it's kind of funny. So the photographer would carry props with him. Sometimes it would be, you know, this horse. That top hat probably did not belong to that kid. You can actually see it in hanging off the horse in the photo of the littlest boy. And so these traveling street photographers would roam around and be like, hey, you want your picture taken? And then you could find them at carnivals, beaches, arcades, that type of thing. So here we're going to jump again. The picture on the left is a version, two different versions of the same snapshot. So you have a tinted one, and then you have an untinted one. And the one on the right is one of my favorite snapshots that I found last year. and haven't had the heart to sell yet. World War II guys in Hawaii, they got a little lonely. This is from the same album as that snapshot. The guy on the right is the one in the photo booth. I love photo booth images. It's one of the reasons I haven't had the heart to sell them yet, because I absolutely love this series, even though it would be very, very easy to sell it. I will give you my Instagram at the end. I have a Instagram dedicated to handsome men, and this is a selection of photo booths on the page. So another thing I collect and sell are photo objects. I don't know if any of you have come across china or porcelain with photos on them, but I really love that kind of thing. And I'm sure most of you have seen photo buttons like the one I'm holding with my blue fingernail at the top. That's one I bought and sold last year. The one on the left is hanging behind me in my kitchen. You can't see it, it's too far away. And then the photo cutouts are another fun thing that you can still get them made now, but I prefer the older ones from the middle of the century and before. So now we're nearing the end. I stuck in a few later snapshots just to show you that these are also desirable, that Polaroid probably from the 80s, but that kind of thing definitely is interesting to photo collectors. And then the 3.5 by 5 snapshot, if it has an interesting subject, I don't buy a lot of them, but I bought that one because it's a pretty cool photograph. I put in some interesting references. So some of you might be aware of the Daguerrean Society. I've been kind of like a default member its whole existence, just because my dad was a founding member, and it's been around since 89, I think. And this year it's in Boston at the end of September, and you can check it out. They do a symposia with talks and a trade fair. I'm actually giving a talk this year. More about that another time. I don't know if all of you are aware of military images. It's a really good reference for especially Civil War images. The guy who is the editor is really great and does a really good job getting a diverse amount of articles and just imagery. And someone actually wrote me today asking for information on where to find photographers in the 19th century. And unfortunately, there were so many of them, it's really difficult. And, there are photographers of California, women photographers of Delaware. There's lots of references of specific places. But this website is one of the few that tries to cover all of daguerreotypes. It doesn't. The guy has passed away. He was still adding every day to the research before he died. His wife has kept the website up for us, which is very nice of her, for the past 10 years since he passed. So it's a little clunky, but it does give you good information. And you can also find his books out there. So 3 basic books. Newhall's Daguerreotype in America. He also has several other books. Beaumont Newhall was preeminent historian of photography. He was also curator at MoMA and other places, right as photography was first being thought of as an art and as something that we should be thinking about in the early 20th century and up in, forget when he retired, but anyway, something to check out. The middle book, The American Daguerreotype, somewhat hard to find now and a little expensive, but still very good. Floyd and Marion, who I was fortunate enough to know in the 80s, they wrote several really good books about cases and daguerreotypes, and I forget what their last book was about now, but also worth checking out. And then the last book is a catalog from the first real daguerreotype exhibition in America, to like really draw from a diverse group of collectors and institutions, and just like really get in there ever, I guess, in this new collecting world. So, and then I can send this out later, but just to give you a brief, the first book, the Nelson Atkins Museum has one of the best photo collections of early photography in the world. They had some sweet, sweet Hallmark card money behind them for a long time, and they were able to buy anything they wanted. And so that book is really great. The curators, who are unfortunately no longer there, but they were excellent. And yes. The second is an article. Denise Bethel was the head of photographs worldwide at Sotheby's, and she wrote this article about the connection between photography and the book trade, which is really interesting and pertinent for all of you. And it talks about like the beginning of the photography dealing and how it happened with books. The next one is Carte Visites in 19th Century America, photography, and it's really like the basis book for that kind of thing. The next one is Limelight. Helen G was one of the first gallerists in New York to display any types of photographs in her gallery. And so it just talks about her gallery. And so this is not really vernacular, this is fine art, but it's still a really good book. The next one, American Photo Booth, Naki Garanan, The History of the Photo Booth, really digs in, and it's like firsthand research and really interesting. The next one, The Art of the American Snapshot, is Stacy and my friend's Robert Jackson's collection at the National Gallery from back in 2007. It was a gallery show, and then it really goes into the history of the snapshot. The next one is a really fascinating book that I loved because it talks about the history of paper photography here in the US, but early paper photography, the calotype, so that's salt prints, which I don't think gets enough interest. The next one, Important Photographs at the Met from the Gilman Paper Company. The Gilman Company, like the photographs at the Nelson Atkins, there was a lot of money behind that collection, with also a very good curator, Pierre Proximy. You know, it's all about the curator and the curator's eye, right? So another catalog to check out. The next one, Robert Flynn Johnson, who was curator out in San Francisco. This is his personal collection, and they're all anonymous photographs. Excellent book. And the next one is about photo postcards, very good introduction into the subject and excellent photographs. The next one is about identification specifically, and it gives, if you can find it with the pullout that zooms in on the different prints, that even better. Although I think you can find it online too. Cabinet Cards in the Making of Modern Photography was an exhibition in 2020. Unfortunately, no one got to go because of COVID. That was also our friend Robert Jackson's collection. He collects a lot of stuff. The next one is one of the best daguerreotype exhibitions of a specific artist, Southworth and Hawes. And then a history of women photographers. We need to have more of those. And then here's my information, and I'll take questions.
Hey, do we have any questions in here? Well, I actually have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You said something about you had to sit for a long time with the daguerreotypes. How long was it?
It depended. Like right at the beginning, like the exposures were, they were too long to sit for, right? Like
what's
half an hour.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so you couldn't make a picture of a person, right? But once they figured out how to use chemicals and get better lenses to like there are ways to like speed up the process, right? So certain people were tinkering with that right away, and they were like, wait, I can make this better. Like you just needed better chemists and better, like more brains on the matter, right? So they figured out how to like put it down into minutes and then into 30 seconds. Like the DAG I sat for when I was 16, I think was like 30 seconds. And I smiled the whole time because I was determined to smile. So
yeah, actually the other question I had was the photo postcards. You said some of them are very valuable. What is the difference between a valuable one and then not so
people, the really like high-end photo postcard collectors, they want like social history stuff. So something especially like, okay, so is it women's suffrage, or is it some kind of really interesting store that's selling photo postcards, or is it like out west somewhere with Native Americans, or is it some, but then again you could put an entirely mundane postcard of a town in Iowa on eBay and it could sell for like $1,000 just because 3 people want it and they don't have that town scene. You know what I mean? It's like anything. Like certain things have a rarity that or a photographer is sought after, just like anything. But I'm slowly learning my way better in that world, because the world of photographs is slightly different, because I tend to sell photographs by the image, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty, or that's a good photograph. And
right, that's subjective, but yeah.
But with photo postcards, sometimes you have to look like a different level of you're like, oh, is that town important?
Right.
Like sometimes I still don't bother, and people probably get good deals from me, but
and my last question is, when did the whole photographing people who had died go out of when did that end?
I don't know. I think you stop seeing it. You see some snapshots of them, but I think you stop seeing it in the US probably in the early 20th century. You see it a little later in Europe, maybe.
Mhm.
You don't see many postcards of dead people.
Oh, okay.
And that's like teens and 20s, 30s. And you don't see many snapshots. But you see mounted photos sometimes that are later, like the folder photos, but not often.
Right.
And they usually are people of European descent. Like you can tell they're immigrant families.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, I would say immigrant in the US, but immigrant people are later. And for the most part, collectors want the earlier ones.
Got it.
Yeah.
Let's see, do we have any questions here? Am I not
I don't
seeing?
have,
Okay.
I think I'll have to end screen
Okay.
sharing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erin. That was fantastic. I actually learned a lot. And if anybody has any questions, just get in touch with us. And if anybody has any ideas for future talks, please reach out.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot. See you soon.